Good morning. It's Jane Brookman here from the KTN, and I'd like to welcome you to day 2 of the GCRF AgriFood Africa West mission. As you may remember from previous events, we have a few things that housekeeping things we like to bring to your attention at the beginning of the morning. Presentations will be available shortly after the meeting on our YouTube channel. So if you miss anything, you're most welcome to view this again. The presentations that are coming through today were pre-recorded to avoid any potential technical issues, but there will be a live question and answer session to the presenters through the YouTube chat. So if you have any questions, put those into the chat box of the YouTube channel or the Facebook, and we will do our best to answer them at the end of the session. We always ask you to network with one another, and there's the networking session this afternoon via Meeting Mojo. We also have our LinkedIn group, and if you're using Twitter to talk about what we're doing today, if you remember, the hashtag is AgriFood Africa. As always, if there's any questions or queries, please email us at gcrf.agrifood@ktn-uk.org for help. Now, we've actually got a change in our speakers this morning. So due to one of the speakers being unable to turn in this morning. So we start off this morning with Ben Bennett from the University of Greenwich on intra-African agricultural trade. We then got Rishi Rathatha, I do apologise, Rishi, Rathatha, on financial options to smallholder farmers in West Africa. He works on the GSMA Agritech Programme. We then have Sandra Hill from the Biopolymer Solutions on high protein, shelf-stable expanded snacks based on arthropods and local carbohydrate sources. So without further ado, we will go on to listen to Ben. Thank you.
Hi everybody, my name's Professor Ben Bennett. I'm Deputy Director of the Natural Resources Institute, which is at the University of Greenwich in the UK, and I've been asked today to talk to you for a bit to try to introduce or answer the question, why doesn't inter-regional trade work in Africa? Why doesn't Africa feed itself? So that's the basic question that I'll address in the next 10 to 15 minutes. The desire is there very strongly to boost inter-African trade and encourage agricultural trade between African countries. And this commitment was made by all of the heads of state of the African Union and all of the countries in Africa. And it's written in stone as Article 5 of the Malabo Declaration of 2014. And this declaration commits member states to boosting inter-Africa trade in agricultural commodities and services. Very impressively, it wants to triple by the year 2025, but as we'll see, we're tripling from a somewhat low base. And it wants to create policies and institutions and conditions, support systems to make that work. The desire is certainly there. The reality up until recently has been rather thin on the ground. So you often hear African leaders talking about Africa or bits of African nations as the national breadbasket or the breadbasket of Africa. But actually, at the moment, in recent years, as a continent, Africa is importing substantially more food than it exports. So it's not self-sufficient, though you might argue whether self-sufficiency makes a lot of sense. They export lots of other good things, which they can use the money to buy food. But the performance of African agriculture in terms of exports and imports has been very good. And the share of global agricultural exports from Africa has been pretty consistently stuck at around 4%. This data only goes up to 2012, so it's a little bit old, and that's one of the challenges you face looking at trade in African agriculture, is that the data is often not very good. So while it might have gone up a little bit more in recent years, this proportion is really very small indeed. So what's the problem? African exports are concentrated on a limited number of traditional commodities. African still exports largely primary goods for processing outside, and it tends to import staple goods for food security. So you can see in these diagrams here that the top African exports by value are cocoa, still, coffee, cotton, and citrus from the agricultural sector. So these have not changed decade on decade for really a very long time, except perhaps with the increase in the price of cocoa. But even so, most of these commodities are processed, and the high portion of the value is added outside Africa, not within it. That's really not a great situation that is still there. In terms of imports, you can see, Africa is a country that produces many of these products, is still importing rice, sugar, maize, milk and cream, meat, fish, and vegetable oil. So exporting relatively high value industrial food commodities, and importing low value commodities that are produced cheaply elsewhere. So how does Africa compare with others? You might say, well, other regions have this sort of problem as well. Well, if you look at this chart here, you can see that the proportion of inter-regional trade within Africa remains stubbornly low. And I put a box around Africa so you can compare it with Europe, for example, where inter-regional trade is a massive proportion of total trade. Whereas in Africa, it's kind of stuck around the 20% mark. So, in sum, what are the problems, or what does the data show us? So, Africa is massively export dependent, but it's stuff going out of Africa and not traded between African countries. The share of exports from Africa to the rest of the world range from 80 to 90% between 2000 and 2017. The only other region with a higher dependency in the world is Oceania. Inter-African trade lags behind all other regions of the world. Inter-African exports 16.6% of total exports in 2017, compared with 68% in Europe. Inter-African trade, defined as the average of inter-African exports and imports, was around 2% during the period of 2015 to 17, whereas you can see from these figures in Europe it was 67%. The 10 leading intra-African exporters, well, the leading one is Eswatini, which is surrounded by South Africa, so it has to export. Everything that goes out has to be exported, so its percentage is always going to be hard. Namibia, a huge country with a small population, quite successful at exporting fish and a bit of meat byproduct into the region. Zimbabwe, Uganda, Togo, Djibouti, also meat, Lesotho, Kenya, Malawi. Not a very, it's when you get to Malawi, you're already down to 38%. In a landlocked country, it's rather small. The 10 countries with the lowest share, Chad, almost negligible. Some big countries in here. Angola, 3.9%, very small indeed. I've included this picture of a bit of a problem in Lagos. Lagos Harbour when it rains. If you've ever been to Lagos, this is what the harbour road looks like when it rains. It grinds to a halt. So what are countries trying to do about this? So the theory is that you should have trade agreements and you should reduce the friction in trade. So there's an effort to make an African regional continental free trade area. 22 countries have ratified this. That's the yellow countries on this map. 52 have signed the preliminary agreement. The Nigerians have decided not to sign either of these agreements, and as you can see from the graph at the bottom, the Nigerians are the single most important countries. It's very important that they are engaged with at some point. Underlying this is a huge web of different trade agreements and free trade agreements, some of which conflict with each other. So I use as an example here the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a serial joiner of free trade agreements, and this kind of tartan map that you see here shows you the 14 different regional trade agreements that DRC has joined and was in 2018. Each of these trade agreements got separate headquarters and standards and tariffs, and it's enormously complicated and somewhat pointless, as we shall see that DRC doesn't trade very much with its neighbours in any formal sense of the word. Quite a lot informally, but not much formally. And then some of these trade agreements that DRC has also overlapped by international agreements, which are generated by all sorts of pressures. Traditional colonial relationships in some cases, development aid plans such as economic partnership agreements, and then this bottom right hand map of Africa here with the patchwork on it shows you the existing regional economic communities, RECs as they are called, and the overlapping web of different RECs. It's somewhat messy, shall we say. So is regional integration working? One of the main reasons for regional integration is to encourage trade between countries. So this data from the African Trade Monitor shows you some of the problems, and I've highlighted DRC because we saw that they're a member of all of those different trade agreements. Have their exports increased? Agricultural exports increased? Share of agricultural trade increased? Well, no, it hasn't. It stayed the same. Actually, some countries are now exporting less than they exported regionally before, and Zimbabwe is a good example of that. In the 90s, Zimbabwe had a very substantial export trade in agricultural commodities and meat byproducts and other grains, and it's actually heading in the wrong direction, not the right direction. So, has regional integration worked again? Tariffs have been reduced or been taken down by this regional integration. But the problem is that the cost to export is still high. So this graph here kind of illustrates that really well. So you can see that the lines are the tariffs, which have been slowly negotiated down bit by bit. I won't bore you with the difference between applied tariffs and MFN tariffs, but the measures of non-tariff barriers, the cost to export, to someone who's moving products across borders out of the continent or between countries, this has gone up at the same time as tariff barriers have gone down. So what has been given with one hand has been taken away with another. So why is it important to have inter-African trade? Well, the theory suggests that that if you can reduce the friction from trade and allow goods to pass between countries, it allows competitive and comparative advantage to come to the fore, and for people to invest and focus on those commodities and products that they have a real advantage in, and then to get scale economies and to move these products across borders to bigger and bigger markets. Africa as a whole is a potential massive market if you could reach all of it. So the theory also goes that this would improve the food balance and encourage self-sufficiency and resilience, because there will be more food locally across different regions and the different geographies and climates to allow some forms of resilience against shock. What stops trade between African states? Well, the key reason that people don't trade traditionally has been tariffs. These are taxes that people pay to move a product from one country to another, and they used to form a really important source of income for countries across Africa. There's been a big effort in recent decades to improve the way that income's collected. So you find value-added tax programs, for example, successfully being implemented. So they're not so dependent on tariffs. So tariffs have slowly gone down. Tariffs are also used to protect domestic industries, to stop goods flooding in from other countries, to allow domestic industries to flourish without non-competitive practices, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for nefarious reasons. The other big thing that stops trade are non-tariff barriers. So these are things like taxes and charges, quality and safety standards, and sometimes called technical issues, import bans, customs and trade facilitation measures, just basically bureaucracy and paperwork and just things that make it very difficult. There's an enormous web of different rules across Africa. So one of these is what's called rules of origin. That's rules that prevent you moving things across a border and claiming that they came from the country that you moved it from when they actually didn't. Very complicated, very arcane, very hard to prove, and sometimes simply stop trade. The absence of infrastructure, ports, roads, railways, policies, price controls and taxes, investment rules, different labour and landlords laws in different countries. In the agricultural sector, something as simple as a national GMO policy can prevent trade, and did famously in 2002 when Zambia denied access to its market for South African maize because they didn't, even though it had been milled, because they didn't have a domestic GMO law that could prevent it. So they just denied it access. Very high transport costs. The cost of containers in Africa is the highest in the world. Dangerous and difficult borders, land borders across Africa on the whole not fun places to be. Can be chaotic, dangerous, not good at night. Inefficiencies in distribution, anti-competitive activities, and so on and so on. There are a huge range of different trade barriers going on. So an example you might find, there's been quite a lot of recent research. ODI have done a good report on non-tariff barriers in the East African community. It's supposed to be a free trade community. Essentially all trade is supposed to be without tax, tariff or non-tariff barriers. Well, ODI found delays to borders, shortage of weigh bridges, very important for trucks. So at each border you had to queue for hours and hours to get your truck weighed so you could pay a levy, official and unofficial bribes and fines, different road use fees, and simply poor roads, particularly in rainy seasons, making transits very, very poor. ODI estimated that elimination of all non-tariff barriers in EAC could reduce regional poverty by 1/2%. Doesn't sound like very much, but regional poverty is a very hard thing to address. This could tackle it directly. Another example is the absence of any consumer agency, the ability of consumers to take any control over the goods that they receive. So the absence of standards and metrology sounds like a very arcane thing, but if you don't have a weighing scale that works, or a measure that you're sure that measure is consistent, it does make all aspects of agricultural trade very difficult, and the person that ends up paying for this, or the people that end up paying for this, tend to be the consumers at the end of the day. So what initiatives might help? Improve national policies, increase transparency, systems that increase transparency and reduce transaction costs, better coordination, measures that increase traceability and trust, More and better data. Trade is driven by data and transparency of data, and improved evidence of benefits. If people realized how much the economy could gain by improvement in trade, maybe they'd make more effort to change the laws and the policies. There are a lot of opportunities, and I just give you a few here. There are a lot of trucks moving around Africa that go somewhere with a product in it and come back empty. I discovered in the late 90s an example of this with trucks taking goods from South Africa up to Angola that were going back empty when the Angolans had counter-seasonal onions. It's a picture of people unloading onions on the right-hand side. Cargo space on flights, scale economies, using byproducts. So byproducts tend to be dumped because they're expensive to move from A to B in trucks. So there are opportunities to turn these byproducts into items of value. There are different commodities that have specific, which could be the focus of specific programs in trade within Africa. And in particular, I focus on meat and fish. There's a fishery or aquaculture boom going on in Africa. So trade in fish and fish products could be very interesting. And the same applies to meat, where you've got people interested and getting more income and living in cities who are interested to buy meat and meat products, but they are importing them from Argentina and India, when there's a surplus of meat in other countries around Africa. There's a huge opportunity there. It's just two examples. High value agricultural products make life easier than low value ones to get leverage and to get started. What would the benefits of greater interregional trade be? Product and market diversification, domestic value addition, improved resource management, scale benefits, investment. There are so many benefits are in inter-African trade. I could talk about them for an hour, but I won't. I think that's enough for that. That was just a brief and very rapid run through why Africa has not got more into African trade in agricultural commodities and what we could do about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, for your insights on the inter-African agricultural trade. We are now going to hear Rishi Rithatha that will give us an overview of the financial options available to agri-food producers in Western Africa.
Over the years, cocoa has stood out to be one of our key economic drivers for Ghana. The agri sector remains this one singular growth opportunity for us, because most of our people, especially those in the rural communities, depend on farming to actually get by.
Mobile money providers can drive financial inclusion and increase their rural customer base by digitizing value chain payments. With the GSMA's support, MTN Mobile Money is piloting a mobile-based solution that enables agribusinesses to digitize payments to farmers for the procurement of crops.
The partnership allows the two organizations to do a user experience research and to go down to the grassroots to talk to agribusinesses.
MTN's M-Agric is a mobile-based application that enables purchasing clerks to record crop procurement from farmers digitally and pay farmers for their produce instantly via mobile money. The application aims to address the inefficiencies of cash-based payments and the challenges of using paper-based systems.
It has improved transparency. The moment a PC buys a bean from a farmer, I notice it on my platform, in my room, or everywhere I am, where there is network.
Digitizing payments with MTN Mobile Money in the agricultural last mile can increase security for both farmers and for purchasing clerks.
Mobile money na bano, mi fie na eda begu mi phone so. Nti say hon bo na ye eniji sempa.
Mobile money can reduce farmers' travel time and waiting time for payments and can give agribusinesses real-time visibility of the procurement process.
Me near my manage mobile money no honest. First na mobile money ni any home. So the cocoa no pa. Debbie or has cow or the bema. Debbie in so or how back horses came. And so I'm say we bear it. Unyayana.
Digital payments can serve as an entry point to financial inclusion for previously unbanked farmers.
Okay, I feel so now. What's Gappy Obasa? Sepio knocking a mobile money on Guhao. The Hanis Gamu in a pay for him, Agika, in a mobile money. Lola Kenene Market Pio. Kehiami, local margin, say first or go or young scar now humble. Happy Bassa, Sepio no Lenny and a mobile money on if you find him.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rishi Raithatha, and I'm an Insights Manager for the GSMA AgriTech Programme based in London. I will spend the next few minutes talking to you about the financial options open to smallholder farmers in Western Africa. The GSMA represents the interests of mobile operators worldwide, uniting more than 750 operators with almost 400 companies in the broader mobile ecosystem. This includes handset and device makers, software companies, equipment providers, and internet companies, as well as organizations in adjacent industry sectors. The GSMA also produces the industry-leading Mobile World Congress events held annually in Barcelona, Los Angeles, and Shanghai, as well as the Mobile 360 series of regional conferences. The GSMA AgriTech Programme is part of the GSMA's Mobile for Development team, which drives innovation in digital technology to reduce inequalities in our world. Singularly positioned at the intersection of the mobile ecosystem and the development sector, Mobile for Development stimulates digital innovation to deliver both sustainable business and large-scale socioeconomic impact for the underserved. The AgriTech Programme's vision is to achieve equitable and sustainable food chains that empower farmers and strengthen local economies. Our mission is to bring together and support the mobile industry, agricultural sector stakeholders, innovators, and investors in the agritech space to launch, improve, and scale impactful and commercially viable digital solutions for farmers in the developing world. We do this through sharing research and knowledge on best practices, running an innovation fund, and providing technical assistance and brokering partnerships. The key agricultural financing gap worldwide is long-term capital for agricultural needs. Long-term financing enables farmers to invest in assets and expand and improve their agricultural activities, but this hinges on the availability of transactional footprints such as record keeping, either digital or paper-based. However, even when farmers have records, such as physical receipts for the sale of crops to agribusinesses, the absence of standardized records and formats to present this information to financial service providers makes it difficult for them to issue credit. Globally, there is a significant financing gap for all agricultural and non-agricultural needs. The gap is greater in sub-Saharan Africa, largely because a smaller percentage of the population has a bank account. Agritech companies capture a wealth of agricultural data that can support farmers in developing an economic identity. An economic identity is defined as a dynamic citizen profile that captures an individual's life events, assets, and transaction history. A digital footprint consists of farmer-level data, such as transactional data generated by mobile money, farm-level data, such as farming record data in a digital procurement tool, and location-based data, such as satellite data from a smart farming tool. Data can be structured, semi-structured, or unstructured, and may not always be relevant for use in financial services. For example, satellite-based data used for disease monitoring can be combined with weather forecasting data, which could then be used for crop insurance payouts for eligible farmers. As shown in our short video, Formal value chains and agri-e-commerce represent ideal entry points for mobile money providers to digitize payments, as they provide strong incentives for buyers to increase transparency, quality, and the predictability of supply. Agricultural value chains have varying degrees of formality depending on the involvement of formal buyers who aggregate and buy crops from farmers. As opposed to informal middlemen-based value chains that are characterized by a high degree of fragmentation in the last mile, formal value chains are structured around agribusinesses and cooperatives that are responsible for crop procurement and aggregation. In our recent report on digitizing payments in agricultural value chains, our analysis found that major value chains suited for digitization in West Africa include milk, oil crops, rubber, nuts, and cocoa. The potential direct revenue opportunity in West Africa stands at $94 million in 2021, which is expected to rise to $123 million by 2025. Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, which the GSMA's mobile money team has termed as a mobile money sleeping giant, has most of this opportunity. Côte d'Ivoire and Mali are also ripe for digitization. To launch a credit product for farmers, effective product design requires a good understanding of the cash outflows of rural households. When designing a credit product for the agricultural sector, it is also important to consider the seasonality of farmers' incomes, that is, their cash inflows. Together with this, it is vital to design financial products that are customized to farmers' circumstances, needs, and revenue-generating activities. The farming journey varies between value chains and geography, and user research is required to reveal it fully. Financial service providers must also consider issues like a gender-neutral approach to credit, for example, allowing collateral registered under women's names, loans that cover a range of crops, models that allow access to higher-priced items such as machinery, and transparency in data ownership and sharing. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for your talk, Rishi. It was good to hear about the financial options available to smallholder farmers in Western Africa. We are now going to hear Sander Hill that will tell us about the AgriTech Catalyst-funded project that aims to develop innovative, high-protein food products using starchy materials and insects within rural Nigeria.
Good morning. My name is Sandra Hill, and it is my pleasure today to introduce you to our AgriTech programme, which is being supported by Innovate and DFID. The consortium for the project consists of small businesses and academic institutions, one of which is based in rural Nigeria. Let me start by addressing the question of why we are so passionate about this programme. I am sure I do not have to explain to anyone that the future can look bleak in regards to the creation of enough high-quality foods for our growing populations, and that protein may well be the critical factor in keeping the world fed. So what can a couple of tiny companies do to help? Well, what these SMEs do have are several lifetimes expertise working with food processing. They also have developed a specific product which they feel is unique in that it can be made from a range of starchy materials and can incorporate high, in fact, very high levels of protein. And that this product is still good to eat and it's safe to eat even after long-term storage at ambient temperatures. The question is, what proteins should be used in such a product? The answer could be lots of protein, but there is a great push to utilize proteins from insects. Insect proteins are nutritionally sound. Growth of insects provides a low environmental footprint, but there's a barrier to their general acceptance as food for humans. This may be overcome by extracting and purifying the proteins, but then the costs, financial and environmental, are increased. Ideally, one should use the whole insects with minimal processing, as long as the resultant product is acceptable to the consumer and is safe to eat. So what we wanted to do is to use protein coming from whole insects with minimal processing rather than proteins which were extracted. So the goal of this current project was to create a product, and into that product to incorporate a high level of protein coming from insects. These insects needed to be sourced sustainably and preferably farmed in a small way within the rural community. The insects need to be processed to make them safe, but without creating difficult waste streams. Using these insects, we want to create a food product that is easy to store, can be eaten without further heating, and is actually very good to eat. So the SMEs had the IP and understanding for the product. We had an academic colleague that understood insect proteins, but we needed somewhere that could supply the ingredients and could benefit from such a product. So we approached the Federal Polytechnic of Oko in Nigeria. This was a very new venture for the UK group, as although we had plenty of international experience, we had never worked directly in Africa. We would not have attempted this without the encouragement and funding coming from the Innovate programme. So in November last year, we embarked on an 18-month feasibility study. The idea was to use locally African sourced starchy materials and insects, and to process these together to form the food product. We felt that this food product had three major outlets. It could be created within and then sold within a local community. We thought it would be a useful product for those who are nutritionally challenged, for example, the urban poor or when disasters strike. And thirdly, it could be an expensive, high-protein snack designed for those who believe this would be nutritionally beneficial. We also had to ensure that it was sustainable and safe. I have already introduced some elements of the consortium, but it is the camaraderie within this group that has been essential to getting this project up and running and keeping it going. The two SMEs and University of Nottingham are situated closely together, but the Federal Polytechnic is much further away in Anbar Estate, marked by the star on the map. I think we made the right decision to go and visit FPO early in the work. This is Joe from the University of Nottingham. This is Mary Okpala, who is leading the whole of our Nigerian group, and that's me. I love the title above the FPO's food technology teaching block, proudly food scientists. That's what we should all aspire to. Only by sitting down and establishing some ground rules for the project and being there in Nigeria, in that locality, could we begin to understand the different challenges for the project. I've also added Innovate as our list of workers because we really needed their support at times. For every Innovate project, you need to have some work packages. And for us, these were relatively easy at the start. We needed to get the right materials. We needed to assess those materials. We needed to make a brilliant product. And then we needed to make sure it was commercially viable. And we need to manage the whole thing. We made a cracking start to the project. We met the people, we'd sorted out which starchy materials we were to use, and we defined what insects we needed. And then the lockdown started to happen. We made the strategic decision that we wanted to keep going. We had created momentum, and there was a lot that we could do. Some things have become very apparent in those first 4 months of the project. We knew that we needed to go back and rethink about some things. And we established weekly calls with Nigeria and with each other in the UK. And we found that we needed to make sure those calls were very carefully structured. And we defined what each partner needed to be getting on with. And in fact, we did achieve a great deal. We really utilised our time to sort things out properly, to read and define and think. We started to engage with several aspects, but perhaps one of the crucial areas that has taken our time is worrying about our insect supply. Thanks to certain members of our team, I know a lot more about insects now than I did a few months ago. But I also learned that some of what one understands from the literature and from reports does not seem to be as informative as it should be. At the start, we believed we could source insects for this project relatively easily, but it has proved problematical. For obvious reasons, we needed a trackable insect resource, and we're struggling with this. We have to thank those at FPO who've sorted out our understanding about how palm weevils are farmed. These pictures were actually taken by Mary. The weevils are grown on dead trees, and the palm wine and the weevils create a joint source of income for the area. However, this was not quite the controlled environment for insect farming that we thought we could tap into. In addition to palm weevil, we expected to include crickets and grasshoppers into our studies. We tried to find a farm source of these that we could use, but have not been successful. So we have decided to farm our own crickets. This was not an easy decision, and a lot of work has gone into establishing how this can be done and our objectives for such a venture. We were very lucky to be introduced to Dr. Honor, and he has helped us to get this farm going. The intention is that we will end up by having an excellent understanding of what actually needs to be done to create a small farm system for black crickets, and also to create enough of these so that we have plenty to add to our own products. So finally, I can report that the insect farm is being created. And we're also concentrating on many different details so that when we get back into the labs and manufacturing areas, we can make very rapid progress. Banishment to our homes has allowed us to take time out and really think about what we've been trying to achieve. It has highlighted a mantra for us. Is it safe? Is it sustainable? Is it sensible? The product we are going to achieve at the end of this project will be safe. It will be manufactured sustainably. Whether it's commercially viable, well, for that we're going to have to wait and see. But we do have 12 months of this feasibility study left. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back, and thank you, everyone. I can understand that there's been quite animated discussions going on in the chat boxes. I'd like to start with a few questions for Ben. There's a question here from Frank O. saying, being primarily associated with small and medium scale farmers in Nigeria, I think he is more concerned about, have you thought about the fact that you've got waste and damage post-harvest? Isn't that basically a primary reason that there's not more export that takes place?
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Frank. As Frank may know, I'm very interested in the issue of food loss and waste and post-harvest losses. The big problem we have with post-harvest losses is that there tends to be a figure plucked out of the air of 33% globally of everything that's lost between what comes out of the farm and what gets to the household, and that's just a guess. It's enormously more complicated than that. So actually, when it comes to inter-African trade, the fact that losses that happen on farm, to some extent they're an advantage because you're only taking the good stuff across the border, but they're also a disadvantage to the farmer because they don't get that value. It's part of a much larger systematic problem. There's a big issue with perishable goods. So you get, tomatoes are the classic example. Vast amount of tomatoes produced in northern Nigeria. By the time they get to southern Nigeria, they're often in very poor shape indeed. So the relatively loss of post-harvest value very great in these high value perishable chains, and that's why infrastructure is so important. If you can move goods thousands of miles quickly and seamlessly across borders on good roads, good way bridges, and no harassment from the local police, then the risk is much lower, and the business that you can do is better, and actually the consumer benefits at the end of the day because the cost price the consumer facing price of all these products starts to decline, and that would be would benefit everyone all round. So yes, Frank's absolutely right about post-harvest losses.
Yeah, and there's a related question, Ben, while I've got you on the phone, from Abdul Rampurawala. He's saying that infrastructure is a big hurdle, which is what you've just said, and he's asked for a comment really on how do you see the infrastructure improving in the short to medium term?
Well, I think it's two things. There's been a huge effort over recent decades, World Bank and the African Development Bank investing in corridors, and this is a good approach. If you focus your effort and your investment in infrastructure on areas of high production and areas of high consumption and the links between those two things, it makes a lot of sense. It's a very logical way of going about things. But at the end of the day, if you've got a beautiful road and a beautiful corridor, and 300 police halts along it, it doesn't really help you very much. So you need the soft infrastructure at the same time as you have the hard infrastructure.
Okay, and maybe that's a cue for me to go to Rishi now and ask him for a comment on that, because you could argue that the digital infrastructure is an important part of maintaining a good supply chain, but how does that fit in along all the other issues such as energy security, the post-harvest losses that Ben was just talking about, and the lack of ability to add value to commodity crops?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I think if I think about recent research that we carried out in Nigeria, we look at a number of ways that different agri-techs, of course, are trying to raise money to address a lot of these problems within value chains, within supply chains, and some of the issues they have to contend with are really, really difficult to surmount, just to overcome on your own. So, for example, in Nigeria, you'll find that 57% of tech companies have cited inadequate electricity compared to, let's say, 25% in Kenya, or 60% citing a lack of finance compared to 26% in Kenya. So I think it is a situation where you have to, unfortunately, try and take matters into your own hands. We have, it's not unheard of where you'll find companies within agriculture, even outside of agriculture, having to try and make sure that they've got their own energy supply. So in this particular case, we know that MTN Nigeria spends about 70% of its operating revenue on generator fuel. the conversations I had with agri-techs went along similar lines, where there was a lot of concern about the fact that they actually couldn't move goods. As Ben said, you've got tomatoes in the north of Nigeria, not just tomatoes, but milk and other agricultural commodities, given the climate there. But just getting them down south where the demand is an ordeal. It could take up to 5 days in certain instances. And by the time it gets there, perishable goods, well, you know what will happen to them. So it's something that, unfortunately, isn't going to solve itself, and you find people taking matters into their own hands. But equally, at the same time, we advocate for improved infrastructure as part of government policy, not just to try and digitize agriculture, but to try and ensure that the infrastructure is there for digitization to actually then improve agriculture and drive efficiency.
Thanks, Rishi. Just a further comment on that, which is a sister program to the GCRF AgriFood Africa, is the GCRF Energy Catalyst, which is also funded both by GCRF and DFID. And I know that there were some comments about cocoa, for example, in Ghana. And so Ghana is one of the countries that is eligible for that program. So I will ask colleagues to put a link to that Energy Catalyst program into the YouTube channel. Okay, thank you. There's been quite a few comments around insects, Sandra, and I think it's fair to say that eating of insects and processing of insects is something that raises temperatures and raises views quite strongly in Europe, and it would seem that it's also true in parts of Africa as well. Would you like to comment on how universal do you think the appetite is going? No, excuse the pun. The appetite is going to be for actually making use of insects versus perhaps using protein from plant sources, as an example, to try and use that as an alternative for insect protein?
It's always interesting, as you say, eating of insects causes quite a lot of comments. In some ways surprising, because we eat shellfish, etc., and you either love it or you hate it. The economic case for using insects and the sustainability case seems to be very, very high, especially if you can use some of the insects without extracting the protein and purifying the protein. The quality of the protein is really good. So what we thought we were trying to do was to incorporate some insect protein along with the starch materials, and some of the starch materials that we are specializing in this particular program are also high in protein. So we've got proteins coming in from legumes and proteins coming in from insects to make a product which in fact has a very high protein level. And the thing about it is, if you incorporate the insects in that way, you think you're eating insects. So it's not quite the same as eating insects on a stick or something.
Sorry, Sandra, I think it might also be worth for the non-nutritionists in the audience to comment as well about how you can have a good and less good protein as well for human consumption. I mean, so that's the point really about the profile of the insect's protein, isn't it?
Yes, so the nutritional balance is excellent from the insect proteins. So it helps address a mixture between the plant proteins and the insect proteins, gives you a very good high quality protein source. So that's what we were trying to do. And we were trying to target insects which we thought would not be unusual for the locality. So within Europe, we've been working quite a bit on mealworms, but we are looking at palm weevils and black crickets for Nigeria.
And a related question is there a market for insect-based animal feed, which again is another a thing that the Brits might be more accustomed to seeing, that the use of insects for animal feed. Is there a market for that in Nigeria? Are you aware?
I would have thought so. And people have been talking in the programme about aquaculture, and using insects as a protein for fish feeds is also being done in Europe. But I'm rather hoping that what we wanted to do was to take something, so we were growing local insects on a local starchy type material and create something for the rural community, rather than having it reprocessed and building into other things.
Thank you very much, Sandra. A quick question here for Rishi, that it's disappeared. Is there, I beg your pardon. It was more along the lines of, are there a lot of job opportunities within GSMA within Africa, or is that an organisation that doesn't actually employ people in Africa itself?
So we have a number of offices around the world. At least we've got an office on every continent, I can tell you that much. Our Africa headquarters is based in Nairobi, and we've got a significant team that work out of Nairobi and travel where required within the region. So certainly we've got members of staff, and I've got colleagues within my team based in Kenya. We also have we've also got a member of staff in our team in the AgriTech program based in Côte d'Ivoire, who handles much of our West Africa market engagement work. So to answer your question, we're always looking for good people, and we're always looking for good people irrespective of where they're from, and there certainly are Africa-specific roles available.
Okay, thank you. And on a related one to that, Rishi, is there's a suggestion of, if one wants to work with telecoms to provide non-bank financial solutions, how can the GSMA help? I guess that's from an individual level, that's on a job idea, but maybe from a corporate level, how does the GSMA actually engage with, say, companies that wanting to set out in setting up new systems, for example?
Sure, thanks, Jane. I saw that question on the YouTube feed from Aminata Kanu, and I think it depends on which country you're in. If you're looking at trying to provide something along the lines of mobile money, then of course there is a licensing process involved, and really it just depends on the country you're in. If you're in Nigeria, then I think there is a slightly more challenging environment, regulatory environment, although that is being liberalized, and certainly we'll see, at least I know of two companies that have been issued with mobile money licenses, with two more being given agreements in principle. So it really just depends on the territory and the market we're talking about.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Rishi. So I'd like to thank all the speakers. We're just over time, and thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Thank you. Bye-bye. And don't forget networking this afternoon. Take care.